church context that I've led at, no man would ever pick up. They were all difficult, right? They were churches that had splits in the past. They were churches that had a major issue going on. Every man that has any other options would choose a different church.
Hey, welcome everyone back to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. I've got my colleague, Reverend Marilyn Williams, on with me. We're doing 2 episodes together in preparation for our course, Women and Power in the Church. Reverend Williams is finishing up her doctorate, and her research is focused in particular on evangelical churches calling women as lead pastors for their first time. If you're interested at all in the class, you can register. All Center for Bible Study classes are donation-based or pay what you can. Really hope to see you there. I think it's going to be a really excellent opportunity just for further conversation and dialogue. And if you haven't yet, please make sure that you are subscribed to our channel. So we love to engage. So if you can like this and give us a comment at the end, that would be awesome. I'd love to engage with you there. And with that, and without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our episode.
All right. Well, we're back for round 2. Thanks again, Marilyn, for being here. And what we wanted to do in this part is you're doing some really interesting research, which is focused particularly on some of these issues that we're talking about, women in ministry, but like you're doing on the ground sociological research, right? I'll let you talk more about it, but of like practical issues of women in ministry in evangelical congregations. The floor is yours. I'd love to hear a little bit about about it. Don't give away too much, right? We want people to come to class, but give them some teasers.
In terms of I would love to do that. First of all, I'm pursuing an EDD. It's like a PhD, but more educationally based. So, and it's in organizational leadership and with an emphasis in Christian ministry.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that's why I'm doing more of a sociological research project.
That makes sense.
And so, I've been interviewing a sample of about 10 to 11 individuals, church parishioners, and also a focus group. And I am exploring how church parishioners experience calling or voting in a woman as a lead pastor within a congregationally led evangelical church in the U.S.
Yeah.
So congregationally led, just for those of you that may not be familiar with church governance or polity terms, basically the ultimate authority of the church is with the people, with the parishioners.
The vote.
So
of the
that's
church.
that's why the title is calling or voting in a woman as lead pastor.
Okay.
So that would be different than, let's say, a congregation where they receive their lead pastor from their denomination. Where they have a hierarchy of saying, hey, we're going to send you, your next lead pastor. So I particularly focused on congregationally led denominations because that's what I'm a part of as well. And I think that's an interesting dynamic because the power is actually in the parishioners' hands. And so that's why I decided to interview parishioners, because they're the ones that will vote in or reject a woman as a lead pastor.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of research about women lead pastor disparities. We have a lot of research that talk about how few we have, the percentages. I mean, I think we're finally up to maybe about 10%, but for a while we were at 6%.
Is that
really low.
all denominations?
Pretty much across any denomination. Yeah. Very low percentage of women lead pastors. There might be some outliers there, but it's kind of in the evangelical world. Okay. So basically what we don't have is that we've researched women clergy. And we found out their disparities. We found out how they're treated. We found out they can't get a job. We found out all that. But what we have never researched is this phenomenon, a woman as a lead pastor, from the perspective of a parishioner.
Congregation. Okay.
Yeah. So what does that parishioner experience? What is that parishioner's, what are that parishioner's feelings? What are their fears? What are they concerned about? What is their background? How did that background dictate their response, their vote, their reaction, the process?
Right.
So that's really what I was digging into. And I'm just really finishing analysis at this point. And not to give it all away, but let me just tell you that the the findings were surprising to me.
Yeah.
And that is, I had hoped, and this is great because as a researcher, you kind of want your study to go in a totally different direction than you thought. That
Right.
means that your biases is not getting in the way. Okay.
Right.
So I had hoped that my study would help churches to get over all the obstacles parishioners are experiencing in order to call women as lead pastors, if that's God's purpose for the church. Okay.
Right.
So that's what I was trying to find. What are those obstacles? What helped you? What could have helped you? All that kind of thing.
Yeah.
What I found is the very opposite, in that people are more comfortable with women lead pastors than ever at any other point in our church history besides the early church.
Interesting.
Yeah. So when I first started collecting my sample for people to interview, I put the word out to, let's say, my colleagues here at Jessup.
Yeah.
And everyone kind of looked at me like, you are not going to be able to find a sample. Like, I can't believe you chose this topic. Like, I don't know anyone that's ever called a woman as their lead pastor. Like, does that even exist? Okay. So
wait, colleagues said that to you?
Yes. Here. Yeah. Like I'd love to help you. I'd love to refer somebody, but are you going to be able to finish the study? Because I don't know of any churches that actually called a woman as their lead pastor.
Interesting.
Okay.
Okay.
So that was the response across the board.
Yeah.
Now, when I advertised it and my denomination advertised it, and Facebook and so forth, and it's a national study.
Yeah.
I had no problem finding churches who recently, in the last 3 years, called their first woman lead pastor. No problem. So right there, my expectation of, hey, this is something that is not happening, and how do I help it to happen, shifted from, this is something that's happening. And so then I began to adjust some of my data collection questions to why. Why is this happening? Why is this happening as never before in our church history? And why are church parishioners feeling more comfortable to call a woman as their lead pastor as never before? Which I didn't expect to find across the board. Now, I tried to do a pretty diverse sample. So I interviewed conservative churches, interviewed liberal church parishioners from church parishioners from liberal churches.
How did you describe liberal conservative, meaning like theologically? Depending on the denomination.
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
Okay.
So they're all congregationally led. Okay, but I asked them to describe themselves. So would you say your church is theologically more on the liberal or conservative side?
Gotcha.
I had both.
Okay.
Would you say your church is old, as in has been around a long time, or very new? I had both. I had churches 100 some years old. I had churches 3 years old.
Gotcha.
Okay. Would you say your church is predominantly older people or younger people? I had both.
Okay.
Would you say your church is predominantly white or multi-ethnic? I had both.
Okay.
Would you say your church is predominantly location-wise on the East Coast or the West Coast? I had both.
Okay.
Okay. So the one common denominator that I could find amongst all these diverse churches that have each of them called a woman as their lead pastor in the last 3 years, and were comfortable with it, was COVID.
Oh, interesting.
So the process, I'm not going to give it all away, but I'm going to say the process of COVID, what happened was, and we'll dig into this more into the class, but each of these churches had lost, or their lead pastor, their male lead pastor, had resigned either during COVID or right before COVID. So they were in the search process for a lead pastor during the COVID pandemic. Okay, so 2019, 2020. Okay.
Yeah.
In that process, each of them had tried to call other male candidates. And every single one of them, the woman candidate was not their first choice.
Interesting.
Each of them tried to call male candidates, but the male candidates wouldn't accept it because it was too hard to move during COVID, to make that transition, to lead a church during COVID. For whatever reason,
whereas the woman candidate, it's like, I don't have as many options.
The woman candidate, the woman candidate was more in each step. The woman candidate, each of them felt called.
Right, but I'm thinking like they might not feel the same level of, hey, it's exactly. They might feel the pressure, like if I'm going to do it, I got to do it.
And that is true. Yeah. Like, I think of the church context that I've led at, no man would ever pick up.
Mm-hmm.
They were all difficult,
mm-hmm.
right? They were churches that had splits in the past. They were churches that had a major issue going on.
Mm-hmm.
Every man that has any other options would choose a different church.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that is an element to it because of the disparities.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, so the positive part about COVID is that it did for the first time open up a door for women clergy wider than ever before. Because these churches, each and every one of them had gone through a long search process, 1, 2, maybe 3 male candidates that they pursued that eventually said no, finally down to their last end. But here's the beautiful thing. At the end of the day, when they found the woman candidate and they called her, each parishioner said, we don't feel like we ended up with a woman. We feel like we got the candidate we needed. We needed this woman. In fact, because of COVID, when the churches started reopening up, what they found is they needed to do something new.
Mm-hmm.
They need to do something different, right? To draw people back.
Yeah.
Okay. They have found that having a woman lead pastor was the different thing that is drawing people back.
Okay.
In the community,
yeah,
their church people that had left are coming back to check it out. So it's like God used this bad thing in the world for something really good to happen.
Oh, that's cool.
And so I'm finding this as really a common denominator of each and every person that I interviewed.
That's fascinating.
And of course, I did a qualitative study, so it's a very small sample.
Yeah,
it's not like a big, thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand, you can't. The generalization might not be as wide, but when you do have that diverse of a sample and you find that common denominator,
it's striking.
It is striking. You're just like, and to be honest, it was humbling for me because I'm older. So like I said, I was a lead pastor in 2013. So my experience was very different and I struggled with my call. And as I am listening to these parishioners tell me that what they have learned through this process is what's important about a lead pastor is their call, not their gender, not their sense of power, not their great man leadership charisma.
Right.
Okay. What they've learned through this process is what they really need is a person who's called to be their pastor.
Wow.
And honestly, if I would interview those same people in 2013, they would not have said that. They didn't value that as much as all the other attributes they were looking for in a man.
And from what you're finding, is it something they realized in the process of calling the woman pastor, or is it more retrospectively once they were under ministry?
I think both.
Okay.
I mean, I think it started becoming clear to them as like they would describe this process, and I gave them plenty of time to describe each of their journeys. They would describe the process of each and every one of them was surprisingly enjoyed and liked the woman candidate more than they thought they would. This was new to them. They had never had a woman lead pastor or even a women pastor before. So they're going to come with a little bit of, I don't know about this, right?
Right.
But as they got to know her, each and every one of them liked her instantly, liked her thoughtful responses, and felt like, I think our church needs her. Like we didn't know that. We didn't know that our church actually needs her right now. So for such a time as this, God is raising up women clergy and opening doors as never before. And not even just my sample. As I look at my denomination, which is a national denomination, almost 900 churches in the U.S., I am seeing emails and notifications about another woman being ordained, another woman being called as lead pastor, another woman being called as a pastor of a church over and over, way more than in my day or the women before.
And that's the evangelical covenant denomination.
Yeah,
we mentioned that in the previous episode. I just want to make sure we got it.
I think that that's even happening in others. And I've not done the research, but it seems like it's happening more and more because of all these different reasons. But it's exciting to me that this has shifted from what my colleagues told me doesn't exist to you guys would be surprised what God is doing right now. There are more women being called, and I'm not talking just associate pastor, discipleship pastor, children's ministry pastor. I went for the top one because I figure if we can figure out the top, then it'll fit every other classification. Okay. I'm talking about lead pastor, like breaking all cultural norms. even challenging some theological assumptions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's really cool. And, I think I don't have data to support this, but I strongly suspect this just in terms of what I see, what I hear, what I've read, that probably the most powerful argument for women in ministry and women in like a lead pastor role is people just getting to experience what it's like.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
when you experience it
Yep.
and you see,
Yep.
wow, this is actually really good. There's a lot
Yep.
of good fruit.
Mm-hmm.
When you see the Holy Spirit working through a person,
Yep.
it's pretty hard to deny that that's
Yep.
the Spirit working.
That's right. That's right.
It's kind of like when Peter was questioned in terms of like, how could you baptize the Gentiles? And he's
Yeah.
like, the Spirit fell on them and spoke to them. What was I supposed to do? Like when you witness the Holy
Yes.
Spirit at work
Yes.
in someone's life,
Yeah.
it becomes much harder to kind of deny them
Yes.
that.
And I think that was another common denominator that I found in each of their different call processes, was that in some way, whether it was like a husband-wife co-interim that was helping the church through this process to find their lead.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for the first time they got to, even though that particular one described that the church really saw him as the lead.
It's funny. Sometimes people can justify it, like they're co-pastors, but everyone kind of knows she's under him, so we're cool with it.
But what he said is because of their perception of that, it lowered their defenses and gave them a chance to see and receive her preaching.
Yeah.
And because now if she would have just come just as a woman interim, their guard probably would have been up.
Mm-hmm.
But because she came as an interim,
mm-hmm.
and they saw the man as the lead, they got to experience the Spirit working through her.
Oh, cool.
And this particular gentleman said he really believes they wouldn't have been ready to call a woman as a lead pastor had not they experienced her.
Interesting.
And the same thing across in other stories where interims were women.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Or they had women guest preachers from time to time, and that helped.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you said, just experiencing the Spirit at work. Like my husband likes to say, he likes to say, honey, I'm not like pro you, I'm pro Spirit. So meaning in the church, I don't hear you, I don't hear male or female, I hear the Spirit. When I stop hearing the Spirit, then I might pull back on what I think you should do, but I don't see male or female.
Mm-hmm.
I hear the Spirit speaking. As long as I can hear the Spirit speaking through you, then I'm good.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting. I was listening to a very popular kind of complementarian thinker talk about this. I don't want to misspeak. I think it might have been Denny Burke or one of the kind of biblical masculinity type, but they admitted that this is a big problem for complementarians, because when people see women in ministry and how good it is when the Spirit's involved, it's like a very powerful argument. And his point was, the complementarian position isn't that women can't do it, it's that they shouldn't do it, which raises a really interesting question. Why would the Spirit gift women to do things that they shouldn't do?
That's exactly right.
I think that's a lot of women pastors that I've talked to, that has been very much their approach, is to not be to allow people to just observe them and see what they do. And I mentioned Elizabeth Conde Fraser in the last episode, but she was sharing a story with me when she took up this small church in, I think it was like Maine or somewhere in the Northeast, and a lot of conservative, I think it was primarily like among Latino churches, but there were a lot of churches there, and they heard this woman pastor was coming, and they lost it. They all kind of were saying bad things about her. So they had this meeting. They came together. They had this big meeting where they were all there and listening, kind of discerning the Spirit. Sure. And a woman stood up and said, by your fruit, they will be known. By their fruit, they will be known. And the pastors listened to that, and they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a season. Yeah. They came to an agreement. We're going to have a season where you don't malign my ministry. You just allow it to happen. And at the end of that, if you're convinced it's not of God, then by all means. Yeah. Right. So they went through the season. By the end of it, they had her all preaching in their churches and, all this kind of stuff.
But I mean, I have, we laugh, but I do respect the fact that this congregation fears God enough to have that meeting. It seems a little ridiculous in our flesh, right? Like, why is this an issue? But the fact that
they're open to listening to the Spirit,
and their motive is to please God, and they don't want to do anything that is heretical. And that's a good sign. That's a sign of a good church.
Yeah.
And any true woman pastor is going to want a church that's going to be like the Bereans, right? And surge out this issue for themselves.
Yeah.
And I think another reason why this phenomenon is occurring exponentially is this shift of how we define leadership is really happening. And again, as we talked about in the last episode, sometimes a church takes its cues from the world instead of be a light to the world, right?
Yeah.
So we have in many ways taken our cues from this idea of role congruity theory, where women have not broken the glass ceiling for years and years and years, been secretaries, not leaders, not executive roles. And we've seen.
Can you
women
redefine that for us, just in case someone's listening to this episode that hasn't listened to that?
And this will be important all the way through the class. I'll refer to it because it's one of it's the base framework of my study. So role congruity theory it basically comes from the social construct of what we expect people to look like, talk like, act like comes from our social context. Okay. So in the West, because women have had such a difficult time breaking that glass ceiling, most of our experience is women in support or communal roles instead of leadership roles.
Right.
So therefore, we have perceived women as communal-type leaders, support-type leaders. On the opposite end, we have viewed and therefore perceive men as agentic type leaders, decision makers, power makers, carry power, move power, hold power. And so these have become gender roles. Yeah. And this is what makes us comfortable. Yeah. Okay. So when we take that and we apply it to leadership, the topic of leadership, sometimes, and I believe in the issue of leadership, the church has taken its cue more from the world, everything I just said, and applied it to roles in the church, whereas women should be the support roles and men being the lead roles. Yeah. But now the world is shifting to where leadership is being redefined as shared leadership. Hierarchical top-down leadership, this one person holding the power and telling everybody what to do, is really antiquated. It's really outdated. Yeah. It's much more about collaborative, shared. How do I lead a group? How not just say how do I lead a group? How does the group lead together? Right. So because of that, what's interesting is that therefore we have become more open to what we perceive a woman leader should be. A woman leader should be communal, because it should be more group-oriented, more support-oriented, not more power-oriented. Okay. So therefore, we are becoming really comfortable with women leading. Yeah. But the problem with that is not every woman is a communal support type woman leader. I'm more agentic. So Todd Ferguson, he's done a lot of research in this area on role congruity theory, and he applied it to the issue of women clergy. Okay. And in 2018, he did a study, and my study kind of follows his study. And he found that women with communal type leadership attributes are having less difficulty becoming lead pastors, being received by their parishioners as why? Because we're accepting that type of leadership. Right. But still, women with agentic type leadership attributes, like more, I decide things more executive style, power, carry more power when I speak.
Now you're doing something that a man should be doing.
Right, right. So they are still having a hard time breaking in.
Interesting.
So, but that goes with the shift of the way the world is perceiving leadership. Right. So it really has nothing to do theologically. Right. It has to do with how we perceive leadership. Now, theologically, it brings us back to the point where how did Jesus describe leadership? What did Jesus say to do with power? Okay, so what's ironic about that is Jesus gave away his power, said to be a servant, which is much more describing a communal, supportive, empathetic, right, humble type leader, which we have prescribed as feminine. Yeah. As female. Yeah. Okay. But yet we've chosen to put men with agentic power type personalities as our lead pastors. Right. That is all shifting. Interesting. So almost all of the sample, every single person of the sample that I interviewed and did a focus group with, is definitely shifted with this call of a woman lead pastor. They've also, not because of her, they were doing it before her, but the reason they were comfortable with her is they were shifting from the hierarchical top-down leadership to a more collaborative,
Yeah.
let's lead the church together. Everybody lean in with your spiritual gifts. It's not a top down anymore.
Is part of that also a rejection in part of the kind of mega church model or boomer model of
It could
church
be
as big booming business?
Yes,
and
it could be definitely, but I think it's bigger than that. Like,
Okay.
I think it has to do even
How do you
outside
test
the
for
church.
it, by the way? Like, what kind of questions get at that?
Yeah, I'd ask for their governing model.
Okay.
What was your governing model before?
Okay.
And what were you looking for when you called this next pastor?
Mm-hmm.
And for instance, one church said we had a charismatic, really good male pastor.
Mm-hmm.
Loved him, like,
Mm-hmm.
but everything he said we thought was the perfect idea,
Mm-hmm.
and we did.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we did it, and we just thought he had all the ideas, and we followed everything he did. And
Mm-hmm.
then one day he stood up and said, "This is wrong. You shouldn't all be doing just because I say you should do it.
Right.
We should be doing this thing together." And he stepped down
Wow.
to challenge their paradigm.
Okay.
And he told them, you need to learn how to be more collaborative instead of just lean on one person with power.
Yeah.
So he stepped down. So then they were looking for a pastor that will help them reframe how they lead the church.
Mm-hmm.
And they did find some male, more communal type leaders, but
Mm-hmm.
they just declined the
Mm-hmm.
offer, like I said.
Mm-hmm.
But then when they got to the woman who has a communal type leadership, they really liked her. Now, what's interesting is they did have a woman interim who was more agentic in her leadership style, and they didn't like her.
Oh, that is interesting.
Yeah, so they didn't like her. So it wasn't that they were like open. It wasn't that they called her because she was a woman. They called this particular woman because she had the communal, empathetic values that they're looking for in leadership nowadays,
Mm-hmm.
rather than the old style of more agentic leadership, male or female.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How much in your findings are generational focus? So I would think that would be particularly true of like millennials and Gen Z.
It was stronger,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't say
it cuts across.
it cuts across, but
the-
it's not siloed.
Yeah.
But it was definitely on a continuum stronger.
Mhm.
But I did have the 125-year-old church, 60-year-old man, who was complementarian, say, okay, this woman we brought is pulling in more people than any of our other lead pastors. She's doing more home visits. She's being more communal.
Mhm.
And I'm finding this is what our church needs.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, he even said no other male pastor has ever found the time to do all this stuff that she's doing relationally.
Interesting.
Now, but that doesn't mean that every woman
No.
is going to lead that way, because I'm particularly not so much that way. I'm more agentic.
Right,
Okay.
right.
So I would still struggle to some degree in being received and being myself.
Yes.
But more communal type leaders are fitting this new model of leadership.
Interesting. That's really interesting. Yeah. And because we've kind of coded the sage on the stage and the charismatic figurehead as male,
Yeah.
that's a big.
Well, and it's ironic too, because I interviewed congregationally led churches, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the lead pastor doesn't even, like in the Constitution,
They don't have any more
They
power.
don't even have the power. It's the church, the parishioners that do, but
there's a kind of
give them the power.
Yeah, there's a kind of charismatic authority.
So they would give their power to the lead pastor, but nowadays no one does that anymore. No one gives your power to one person.
Mm-hmm.
Now everyone wants shared power.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the church is taking its cue from the world, but I think it's a little more aligned with Jesus theology in that sense.
Yeah.
And so communal type women, clergy women, are finding it more acceptable and better experiences becoming lead pastors.
That's fascinating. Yeah. What any other things that you want to
Yeah,
share?
I mean, I think the one outlier to that, which is important to mention, is there was one gentleman in my sample that was from a mega church.
Okay.
And I wasn't in charge of my samples, random people just volunteering.
Sure.
Okay? So most of them were small to medium churches,
Okay.
but one gentleman was a mega church.
Okay.
And he did say, hey, we're a mega church. We have to have an agentic lead pastor, meaning we have to have some, because the bigger your organization to lead, the less personal your leader gets to be. Right. You have to delegate
everything out. Right. And
right.
The lead pastor almost becomes like the CEO.
It's like the manager.
It's like the CEO figurehead president.
Yeah.
And then you have your
So
underlings
you
running
don't
around.
get that personal touch, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
But you are, you're it's much more administrative, much more systematic, strategic, all those kind of things. So they did call particularly and found an agentic woman lead pastor, that they needed her to be that, and they need her to do that. What's interesting is she was serving at a different church and was voted out because she's an agentic woman.
Whoa.
So, but then they were looking for her.
But they had
I would
they had
say
the courage to call a pastor that had just been voted out.
because they understood the differences.
Right.
And that was probably a smaller or medium church, and this is a larger church. Now, so again, you have context, right? You have organizational context. So the bigger the organization, the more agentic leadership you're still going to have happen. You're going to have some sense of hierarchy.
Right.
Okay. But the church, the ethos of the church, the parishioners want this more sense of shared equity, shared leadership in the church, doing this thing together as never before. And women, we have prescribed women as being those kind of leaders for good or for bad.
And yeah, I mean, I guess then there's maybe an opportunity for, as we're thinking through all this stuff, to ask the question of whether this is just a healthier model for leadership that men and women together can.
Yeah, I mean, it does beg the question. We really need to get a handle on the topic of power as Jesus described. It does challenge that's why we've named it Women in Power in the Church, because it is an issue of authority. Like it used to be a woman years and years ago, the church parishioners would receive a woman preaching if they knew that the man in charge gave his blessing. So she didn't come up in any kind of her own power. That's how they justified it.
Right.
Okay. But we have to get back to, what did Jesus say to do with power? What is power in the kingdom? Right? What are we to do with it? And I think that's where, no matter what culture we are, no matter what gender we are, no matter what status we are, race we are, there is this new kingdom ethic, right? The eschaton that God is building us and changing us for. And that's what I think needs to enter into the church in this conversation of who's going to lead the church. We can't even have that conversation until we know what leadership and power should be in the church. Instead of taking our cues from the world.
Well, no, right. Because power gets treated like kind of a zero-sum game. Someone's got to win, someone's got to lose,
right.
And
or churches have become their own 501c3s, and they have it's And I understand with the state, you a certain level of, you have to do your bylaws and you have to become a corporation. But did he envision the church to be a corporation, or is that just something we check the box we have to do? But are we more than that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, it happens. You kind of erect these organizations, and then almost instantaneously, everybody becomes subservient to that. Like the main goal is just to keep the doors open, to make sure the organization thrives. The organization almost takes precedent over the people that it was created to serve in the first place.
And it used to be that you needed a charismatic male to attract and keep people in the church as an organization. Right. Now people aren't as attracted to that.
Right.
Now, in fact, they're turned off by that as never before.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've heard, since I've moved back to this area, I've heard multiple times people talking about, oh, where do you go to church? I'm really struggling because, you go to this church and I just feel like this guy is just talking at me all the time. And people used to see that as just telling it like it is, preaching the word of God, unvarnished truth, baby. And now they're like, no, you're just being a jerk. Like, what is that?
We have really shifted what we have defined leadership to be.
That's really interesting. Well, I mean, there's so many other things like that that raises for me, but I'm excited to see in the class, like, you just take us through more of this kind of material, because I think it's so helpful to see and have an opportunity to kind of see ourselves in the data, or to see ourselves in these different anecdotes within the larger study, and be like, that kind of is a mirror of maybe where I was at one point, or maybe where my congregation is. And then how can I think then through where
every single individual in my study at one point did not support women as a lead pastor.
Oh, is that right?
So
That's
I was
interesting.
afraid, because I'm
That's
not
really
in control of the
interesting.
sample, right? So I was
Yeah.
afraid all I would get are the choir. Like, I didn't
Yeah.
want the choir.
Right.
I actually wanted the people who
to
struggled.
hear that. That's kind of
Right.
a gift to be
Yeah.
able to hear
Yeah.
from.
So by the time they came to my study, they had come around. I wouldn't say come around, but they had changed their position.
Right.
But then I got to ask them what changed.
Right.
Right. And so
Right.
how did that change for you? And
Yeah.
what was the learning process for you, and what was that like?
Yeah.
And that's part of the study.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good place for us, like, to kind of wrap this is, do you have like maybe a cool story or two that stands out to you in terms of like someone talking about what did it for them, or like what changed, or even just kind of generally, I mean, we already talked about just the experience, but I'd be just interested to see if you have any.
I think generally, and we talked a little bit about this in the beginning, but just to repeat it, and it's worth repeating, is that their experience of having a female leader in the marketplace, being under a female leader in education, in other fields other than clergy that aren't so male dominated, helped them.
They were able to make a connection.
They were able to make a connection. It's like, I call it cookies on the shelf. They had a couple cookies on the shelf that they could eat from, right? And say, okay, yeah, that did taste pretty good.
Interesting.
Oh, and gosh, it was a good experience, and she did a great job.
Yeah.
So and now one particular gentleman was older, and so he said, now my mom would roll over in her grave. Oh. So he even had to redefine what he was taught as a child.
Yeah.
Right. So, so that was a big process for him. And what the process was, not only his experience with women out in the marketplace, he would say that, but also his realization as he would listen to this woman's responses as they interviewed her. He realized, we need her right now. We don't need what we thought we did. We were looking for the charismatic guy.
Yeah.
Praise God, they declined.
Yeah.
Praise God, they said no. Because as I'm listening to her, that's what we need. And she is more of a communal, support, empathetic type leader.
Yeah.
And he's like, we need someone like that as never before.
That's interesting. Wow. That's really cool. All right. Very cool. Yeah. Well, thanks again so much for this conversation. And again, this is just to hopefully whet people's appetite for the class. We'd love to have you there. Even if you can't be there, the timing doesn't work for you, just keep in mind, we always record our classes, and those will be available. So you can think about registering as well. But thanks, you, Matt. Thanks so much. It's wonderful being your colleague. It's wonderful getting a chance to hear more about your research.
Likewise.
And we're looking forward to more in the future.
Looking forward to seeing y'all. Bye.
Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.